and altogether not without ground, since both the oracles of Delphos and Sibylla's prophecies were wholly delivered in verses. For that same exquisite observing of number and measure in words, and that high-flying liberty of conceit proper to the poet, did seem to have some divine force in it. Now here he gives you instances picked up. The reason of giving instances is that he wants to prove his point, and this is how this will be called a critical essay. This is called literary criticism. All criticism is based upon proofs, evidences that he lays down upon something previously done, some research previously done. So therefore he wants to emphasize that whatever he is saying has a logic behind it, has some reason on which he is placing his argument. So he is supporting his argument with the oracles that were the prophecies of Delphos and Sibylla. These are again from poetry, from Homer and from who has written Oedipus Rex? Aeschylus. So these writers make use of these oracles. And how are these oracles able to prophesy? That's only when a character stands in front of them, says certain verses, and these verses have to be spoken in certain numbers. Number and measure means it has to have a rhythm. It has to maintain some feet that we study in poetry. Rhythm and feet and meter. All that, when that sits in place, only then can an oracle speak to you. Only then can an oracle prophesize to you. So this again is based on verses delivered in proper number and measure. And that high-flying liberty of conceit, now that's imagination. That imagination has to fly high. Imagination has to go beyond a point of ordinary thought. I time and again give you the example of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, when she was able to think out of the box of creation of humankind, which has become possible in 21st century, would not have been possible in 19th century. That was only the high flight of liberty of conceit that she could make use of. That's also something proper to the poet, that oracles speak to you. Now inside that also, what do you see? It appears that there is some divine force in poetry. Some divine force in poetry. And may not I presume a little further to show the reasonableness of this word vetis, and say that the holy David's Psalms are a divine poem. Now Psalms, I have told you already, these are songs. David's Psalms are the songs that he sang in praise of God, or where he praised the creation of God. They are called David's Psalms. This is Prophet David, who had a beautiful voice, and with the songs that he would sing, he would actually make mountains move, rocks move. That is what he calls divine poem. He calls Psalms divine poem. Divine poem is the name given by Philip Sidney to David's Psalms. Psalms he calls divine poem. The reason he does that is critically showing you through logical reasoning and judgment that whatever he is making a point, he wants you to believe in it, because he is giving you evidences. If I do, I shall not do it without the testimony of great learned men, both ancient and modern. He is giving you testimony from religious texts like Psalms. He's giving you examples from pagan texts. He's giving you examples from myths and epics. So both man-made and divine revelations to prove his point. Both ancient and modern, something that came from long history and something that is present history. But even the name of Psalms will speak for me, which being interpreted is nothing but songs. then that is fully written in meter, as all learned Hebraians agree. Hebraians are people well learned in Hebrew. All Hebraians agree, although the rules be not yet fully found. Lastly and principally, he is handling his prophecy, which is merely poetical. For what else is the awaking his musical instruments, the often and free changing of persons, his notable prosopoias, when he makes you, as it were, see God coming in his majesty. His telling of the beast's joyfulness and hills leaping, but a heavenly poesy, wherein almost he shows himself a passionate lover of that unspeakable, everlasting beauty to be seen by the eyes of the mind, only cleared by faith. So for that clarity of the faith, for your faith to be as clear as you are able to see, not just by your eyes, but with the eyes of your mind, you can close your eyes and watch that beauty of God's creation with your mind. That's clarity of faith, and that can again be acquired only when you have a good hand, a good understanding of the Psalms, as David would sing for you, as David would jot down for you. So you are able to enjoy his majesty's grace, the happiness that beasts enjoy in their in the blessings that God has upon them, in all creations like hills and beasts and everything else. So it's the beauty of the mind that you can acquire only when you have a musical sense of things. So that's again one more evidence or one more proof he is giving to you. But truly now, having named him, I fear I seem to profane that holy name, applying it to poetry, which is among us thrown down to so ridiculous an estimation. But they that with quiet judgments will look a little deeper into it shall find the end and working of it such as, being rightly applied, deserves not to be scourged out of the church of God. So he says apparently poetry is put in a separate category of profanity, whereas psalms are put in the other category of sacred music, sacred songs. And this sacred music and profane songs cannot be spoken of in the same breath, but he does that. And then he clarifies that I want you to have a deeper sense of things. You need to have quiet judgment and look deeper into things, and you will also find that they are but just poetry, and that you do not need to separate it from the church of God. It doesn't need to be scourged out of the church of God. What is he trying to do? He is trying to give the heavenly and divine divine place to poetry. He wants to bring poetry back into the category of the sacred and not be renounced as a profane thing. Poetry should not be declared profane, as Puritans want to do, as Stephen goes on also wants to do. He wants to scourge out poetry from the church of God because of the flight of imagination. You tend to keep fiction away from sacredity. I would like to give a break here because we are close to the end of what Romans think about poets and how he brings up the judgment of the Romans about poetry and places his argument on them. Before I move on to what Greeks have to say about poetry and how they treat poetry in ancient ages, I want you to critically evaluate what all we have done, go back to the previous passages, and then come up with questions. I give you just a few minutes. But now let us see how the Greeks named it and how they deemed of it. The Greeks called him a poet, which name has, as the most excellent, gone through other languages. It comes of this word poein, which is quote unquote to make, wherein I know not whether by luck or wisdom we Englishmen have met with the Greeks in calling him a maker. So he says, we as Englishmen have a closer name to the poets as Greek had it, a poet. A poet means a maker, and we also call him, we call him a poet, and they used to call him a maker. A poem means to make. Which name, how high, incomparable of title it is, I had rather were known by marking the scope of other sciences than by any partial allegation. There is no art delivered unto mankind that has not the works of nature for his principal object, without which they could not consist, and on which they so depend as they become actors and players, as it were, of what nature will have set forth. So it's a poet is observing nature, the making inside nature, and then he makes something as a copy of it. This you must have already done, Aristotle and Plato, mimesis. All poets are basically working on a mimetic basis. They are copying the creation of God. Human beings in our societal relationships is also something that God has made, and they are only copying it. So doth the astronomer look upon the stars, and by that he sees set down what order nature has taken therein. Astronomer studies stars, something that nature has set already for him. The principal object of his study is something that is natural, that nature has set for him. Then geometricians and arithmeticians, in their diverse sort of quantities, in various quantities, what are they quantifying? What are they quantifying? Again, it's based on something that naturally exists. So doth the musician in times tell you which by nature agree, which not. So musicians also do the same thing. When they see the rhyme, one rhyme fits with the other rhyme, they see how naturally some rhythms can fit with each other. Sounds also are basically acquired by nature. For example, the chirping of birds, then the rustling of leaves. You hear these natural sounds, and this is where the musician actually acquires the sensitivity towards music. The natural philosopher thereon has his name, and the moral philosopher stands upon the natural virtues, vices, passions of man, and quote unquote, follow nature, says he. Now this is about the philosophers like Plato. What do these philosophers do? They recommend what are good natural virtues, what are vices, what is good for a man to do, what is wrong for a man to do, how do you need to control your passions. And these philosophers also say follow nature. Nature dictates this and nature dictates that. Now that dictation is picked up from how other animals live, how is the natural tendency of human beings to be. So this is what they base the rest of the philosophy upon. The basic object of observation is nature. Follow nature therein, and thou shalt not err. If you follow nature, you will not ever err. You will not commit mistakes. You will not go awry. The lawyer says what men have determined. The historian what men have done. So lawyer talks about what all men before them have determined, considered to be right and wrong, and historians what people have been doing. Again, they are studying nature. They are studying natural existence of human beings. The grammarian speaks only of the rules of speech. The grammarian speaks only of the rules of speech, and the rhetorician and logician, considering what in nature will soonest prove and persuade, thereon give artificial rules which still are compassed within the circle of a question according to the proposed manner. Now this here tells you about how logicians work. The work of logicians has already been dealt with in a greater detail in the initial lectures of criticism. How does a logician work? How does a rhetorician work? They try to persuade men. Rhetoricians try to persuade men with their language. Logicians try to persuade people towards a logical reasoning, a reason that proves a point. So these are artificial rules, he says. There are artificial rules that logicians and rhetoricians follow, but still they are based on some question which is again natural. The physician weighs the nature of man's body, the nature of things helpful or hurtful unto it. And the metaphysic, though it be in the second and abstract notions, and therefore be counted supernatural, yet doth he indeed build upon the depth of nature. This is how object of study in all enquiries is nature. So this passage is important from examination point of view, where many a time you are asked about where does he compare grammarians and for example, how does he say grammarians have their basic object of study as nature? Questions like these. There are most of the time questions surround this portion in competitive exams. I'll leave you here because I have another class at 3:30 with some other people.